Samurai Talk. I'm your host, Kuryu Matsumoto. I will offer you today our Samurai Talk special. Our host for today is Hiromi Yano. Mr. Yano and I've known each other for several years, sharing thoughts and emotions. Today, he will be sharing on our behalf our thoughts and emotions with a friend of his, freelance writer, BillRoberts. And if you people get curious, get an urge to take on this task of interviewing a big-time person and bringing your guest and whatever you call it, challenge corner, a challenge or gate crushers program. So back to Mr. Yano's interview. Here is Mr. Yano interviewing Mr. BillRoberts.
Welcome back to None's channel. Special edition sponsored by Memonos in Japan. I am Hiromi Yano. We are talking with BillRoberts, and we are going to ask him more about how and why and when he came first to Japan. How you and when you came to Japan first?
When the first time I came to Japan?
Yes.
I came in the spring of 1999 with my ceramics teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to know more?
I do. I do.
So, I started working in ceramics in around 1998. My father had died a year earlier, and around that time I was also starting my freelance career. Things were very distressful on me, and I was looking for some outlet, creative outlet, that was completely different from writing and reporting and everything. So I discovered this teacher in Santa Cruz, California, not too far from where I lived. I took a workshop with her, and then I started working in her studio once a month. I really loved working in clay, and I don't know if it made me feel better, but I really enjoyed what I was doing. And I would end up working in clay for about 10 years. She had a very unusual approach to teaching about art. She taught that any art form, ceramics or otherwise, is a spiritual practice.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never heard of this before.
I see.
You know, we think of it as aesthetic or something in America. And it would turn out, I didn't know it at the time, but it turned out her idea had a lot of its roots in how Japanese artists
How did you come to know?
How did I know about the Jap? Well, that came later. So what happened was, I'd been working in her studio and for several months, and sometime near late 1998, she comes into the workshop one day, very enthusiastic, and says, I'm going to take a group of my students to Japan next year, in the spring of '99. Well, it turns out she had studied traditional Japanese arts in Japan, and this idea of art as a spiritual practice was her idea originally. She had that idea for many, many years, but when she went to Japan, that idea was validated in her own experiences and in meeting with Japanese artists. So she was going to take a group of her students to Japan to have that similar kind of experience. I was very ambivalent about Japan. Even though I traveled a great deal and I enjoyed travel, Japan was never high on my list to places to visit. But she pulled out some photos of these amazing tea bowls and told us these were made by an amateur Japanese artist who had been a religious leader and had done these tea bowls in the 1940s. Well, I was immediately captivated by these tea bowls. And I said, I need to know not only the technique, but the spiritual path of the man who made these tea bowls. So I signed up for the trip.
So you came to Japan, finally.
We came to Japan. We came in late March and early April of 1999. We were there for at least the first week of sakura season. Cherry blossoms everywhere.
Best time.
We stayed near Kyoto and we visited shrines and Zen gardens, and we saw all the cherry blossoms, and we went to museums and we met with artists, and it was a life-changing experience for me. It opened my eyes to beauty and in a way that I'd never seen beauty before. So that first trip to Japan, I was ready to come back as soon as I could, and I did. I came back with her a couple of times before I started coming on my own.
So approximately how many times you've been to Japan?
This is my 16th trip since 1999, and I usually come, now not in the early days, I came for 2 or 3 weeks the first few times, but I usually come for 3 months at a time, and that's the maximum stay on a tourist visa. So that's why I come for 3 months.
And what was the purpose of?
Well, I continued to study the Japanese arts, and especially pottery and ceramics. And then I spent 14 months here in 2004 and 2005 writing a book.
A book? About what?
About the Shinto sect called Omoto, which is one of Japan's new religions, founded in 1892. And it turns out the artist who made the tea bowls that caused me to come to Japan in the first place was one of the co-founders of that religious group. So I wrote a book about Omoto. It was published in 2006. Since then, I've been returning and doing a lot of photography with the intention of publishing a photo book on Japan, hopefully in the next year or two.
Well, good luck with the project.
Thank you.
You have visited many foreign countries, and you've been in Japan 16 times this time. And can you characterize Japanese? I know it is next to impossible to generalize the nation. Of course, there are many people in one country, but could you do that?
So you want me to talk in stereotypes?
In stereotype or just image?
Well, you know, stereotypes exist because there's some reality in them. So, well, this is my first reaction to your question. Every time I go to Japan and then I return to the United States, I have to readjust to the rudeness of my fellow Americans.
I see.
And I don't consider America to be the rudest society on the planet.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
But the Japanese are so polite and civil and gracious that it really is an adjustment coming back from Japan to the U.S.
Wow, that's a quite statement. Anything else strike you about the Japanese?
Yes, actually. I think any product made in Japan is a good, if not great, product. You know, I spent nearly a decade in Detroit at the daily newspaper. Detroit is the home of the U.S. auto industry.
Yeah.
I was there during the 1980s. When I was there, the U.S. auto industry was really struggling in its competition with the Japanese, and Japan did not have many friends in Detroit. And I was sympathetic with the problems of the U.S. auto industry, but after doing some research, I realized they had contributed to their own problems. For example, they had really turned their backs on any of the modern statistical quality methods that improve both process and product, and the Japanese had really embraced those methods. So the auto industry, the U.S. auto industry, took years to finally do that and get on a better track. So, you know, during one of my earliest visits to Japan, I had this epiphany. You know, it was in a tea ceremony, and I realized that a culture that could do the tea ceremony with all of the care and precision and attention to detail that it takes was, of course, going to make really good products and also improve the process of making really good products. There's something in the cultural DNA of the Japanese that just gives them this ability to see how things go together and to do a better, more effective job.
My goodness, the tea ceremony and car industries. Who knew the tea ceremony had anything to do with making cars? But I see your point.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about weakness? Do you see in Japan weakness?
Weakness? You mean issues or things? Yeah, sure. Let me talk about three things quickly.
Yes.
And these are also a lot of these come from my experience in covering the electronics industry for many, many years, because I've looked at Japanese industry quite a bit in that regard. Let's see. First of all, there's a lot of talk about Japan decision making by consensus. And I understand why it exists. I think it's a really good idea in principle, and I think it probably works much of the time, because if you decide by consensus, people agree and will get on board with the plan. But what I've seen in business often in Japan is they debate their decisions for so long that they miss an opportunity to take action. So that's one thing. Another issue is, I think there's a really hierarchy, or the hierarchy in Japanese business and organizations does not support people, company workers being critical or evaluating or making recommendations about policies, about bosses and things like that. I think that's, there are a lot of American companies that struggle with that too, but I think it's a bigger problem in Japan. And I've heard the stories that the only time a Japanese worker can criticize the company or the boss is when they all go out getting drunk together, and then everything's forgotten the next day. Well, I think it's a real problem. Not that they're going out drinking together, that's fine, but that they can't, in the day-to-day workforce, they can't raise issues about things that might actually make the company better. And finally, based on what I've seen, while Japanese are really good at improving making products, they're not real great at making brand new products from scratch. And I think, they've spent, I know that in the electronics industry, they've spent millions of dollars on research and development that they've never been able to quite get forward into production. So I know that's a lot of business stuff, but those are some things I've seen. And it's somewhat stereotypical, but I think there's truth in them.
But why do you think these are the case?
I think that's a really long discussion, but at the risk of oversimplifying, the Japanese have a real strong sense of community and communal and of the community, of the group. Americans are very individualistic, and I think that there's some of this notion of concern about the group keeps individuals from really taking action or making recommendations or whatever. That's just a real small part of it, I believe.
I have conducted, as I said, the Israeli-Palestinian project. And when Israeli and Palestinian teenagers come to Japan, I always tell them, in Japan, try to listen to others before you say something. It's very important to listen to others. On the other hand, I tell Japanese counterparts, don't worry about listening. Just say whatever you want. Don't worry about listening. Just talk, say whatever you want.
I think that is perfect advice to each of the three groups. I think your advice characterizes their traits perfectly.
This is Hiromi Yano for Knowledge Channel, Tokyo, Japan.